Concepts in a Teacup by HS Consultancy, presented by Harry Sewell. Whiteness as an advantage marker. Well, before we get into what that means, we should start by talking about whiteness. For many people, even the language of whiteness is experienced as provocative. I guess throughout history, whiteness has been associated with what is kind of prestigious and privileged. And once whiteness becomes critiqued, it can kind of feel a little bit unsettling, unfamiliar, and certainly upsetting for many people. But let's just kind of establish whether or not whiteness as a term is problematic. I think it's worth noting that we embrace some of the kind of founding fathers they were of something like psychology, so the kind of people who are held in high esteem, and it translates beyond psychology to other walks of life where people look to Jung for guidance. Now, Carl Jung, as you probably know, born in 1875 through to 1961, kind of really represented African Americans and African people as like being the unconscious of white people, and he was kind of hinting that he believed that white Americans would become black by kind of living in close proximity to African American people. The kind of inference there is that there is this thing called whiteness which is very separate to blackness, which is what he was arguing. But we can kind of jump into modern days and think about in 2011 when David Starkey, the then respected historian, author, multiple publications, and appeared on television quite a lot. He was pretty revered in that world, and he said that the white working class people were kind of becoming black and were developing this kind of nihilistic culture. And his idea about they were becoming black, he wasn't talking about a physicality, but he was saying they were adopting blackness, and that was the kind of language that he used. So it's kind of well established, the belief that there is a thing called blackness as a kind of way of being, and also whiteness. And if you kind of really want to delve into this, you can kind of think about whiteness not just relating to skin color, but a belief in a pure form of something. So here's an example. In the 1960s and 70s in the UK, Irish people were referred to as the white N-word. I'm not going to say what the N-word is, but they were referred to as white N-word. And what that kind of really reflects is this belief that though this group of people had white skin, they weren't living up to the ideals of whiteness, so it had to be recategorized as something else, hence the white N-word people. Or if you look over in America, working class white people who might live in a trailer park, there would be particular derogatory terms that would be used in relation to them as a group. Again, another example of these people being white, but in order to kind of reflect the fact that there is a belief that they don't represent whiteness in its pure form, they become recategorized. And that's what we mean when we talk about whiteness as an ideology, that it's a way of thinking about whiteness as the best, as the pure form. And that shows up when we kind of think about sartorial elegance, we think about fine dining, we think about classical music. Of course, there are classical musics from around the world, but we think about classical music as European classical music. And there are so many examples when you break it down where we normalize the idea that whiteness is the pure form. And the thing about it being an ideology is that it's portable, meaning that people outside of being born into white skin can also internalize that belief about whiteness being the pure form. So you'll hear people adopting a way of speaking and behaving that is kind of more associated with whiteness, because to them they can kind of see it as a passport into the kind of white world, or in fact they think that that is the best, the proper way of speaking. Or you can kind of go to predominantly black and brown societies and you'll find colorism, this idea that the lighter your skin is, the more attractive you're considered to be, the more likely it is you'll get the prestigious jobs. Put another way, the closer the proximity to whiteness, the best it's considered to be, and you get that with hair type. So that's what we mean when we talk about whiteness. It's almost like a shorthand for whiteness as an ideology. It isn't just something about being born into white skin. However, when we think about whiteness as an advantage marker, what we're saying is because that ideology already exists about whiteness being the best, the pure form of things, then if you are born into a skin that matches that, then certain doors are open for you. So at this point, it's worth me just saying that this isn't a polemic piece. This isn't me saying I believe this, and this is why I make that distinction between white privilege and whiteness as an advantage marker, because the term white privilege is often seen as weaponized, and people who are told they have white privilege will argue to say, given the conditions of my life, I can't see privilege anywhere, and it becomes a to and fro piece where someone's saying, well, it isn't to do with that, it's because of these other things, and the argument often dissolves with people holding different positions. The language of whiteness as an advantage marker is saying, I'm not arguing about whether or not not me, but I'm not arguing about whether I think you have privilege. I'm saying when you look at research, scientific research that controls for other factors, being born into white skin affords you an advantage as follows. It means that if you're applying for a job and you've got a white sounding name, it increases the likelihood that you'll be called for an interview. If you're in front of a jury and you are perceived to be white, it increases the chances that you'll have a more lenient sentence. Again, not that I'm saying these things, that there are research studies that have control for other factors that will tell you that. If you're a young person moving through the criminal justice system, if you've got mental health problems, you're more likely to get a response to your mental health problems if you're white than if you're black. If you are a university professor, the quality of your performance is going to be perceived to be better just by virtue of being white. If you're a student and you're white, you're more likely to get support to kind of get you through if you're struggling than if you're a black or some other kind of racialized person. So these are studies. So as I say, this isn't about me kind of saying, oh, I believe this to be true. If you really want to kind of start your journey into looking at the research evidence, if you want to kind of pull it apart, you can kind of start with Keon West's book, The Science of Racism, and then look at the articles, the journal articles that will point to the research studies and follow those up and go and look at source. And then you can kind of critique whether or not you think that there are some kind of fundamental flaws in the research methodology. Just to reassure you, Keon's already done that, but you can kind of do that for yourself. But I'm just saying this to remove the bit of the conversation that goes, oh yeah, but maybe there were other factors, maybe it was another reason. That has been taken account of in the research methodology, and what you have is the kind of stark data, as I've kind of told you. So we end up with this reality that being born into white skin kind of creates these advantages. Now we could open up a conversation to say, well, why? What lies behind that? And that's a conversation absolutely worth having. The bit about whether you believe me or you think it's right is a kind of, it's a moot point because that work's already been done. So that's why I think the language of whiteness as an advantage marker is far more favourable than talking about privilege, because talking about white privilege, I'm almost trying to convince you that you have something, and sometimes people feel that it's an accusation that you have this thing, whereas a statement of fact, the research evidence tells us unequivocally that being born into white skin creates these advantages. That is it. That's what whiteness as an advantage marker means.